justice system, and we sentence and detain them as if they were 20, 30, 40. And so that's a debate that's happening in New York State. What's the waiver age in Florida? Where are you guys at? 16? I don't think that's true. I think New York and North Carolina are the only ones with a waiver age of 16. 17 down here? Okay, all right, so you're more enlightened than we are. Think about what a waiver age might mean in the context of what we're talking about here as I get to neurodevelopment and brain functioning. Okay, I'll get there in a moment. But Washington State is looking at juveniles who are incarcerated or detained at some level of juvenile justice. And they found that 83% had a score of 2 or more, and about 34% had a score of 4 or more. I've got a colleague, Bob Foltz, he's a psychologist at the Chicago Professional School of Psychology. He works very closely with the Association for Children's Residential Centers and has been working and looking at children who are placed in residential level care throughout Illinois and throughout the Midwest, and looking at their ACEs exposure, trauma exposure, and the relationship to how many medications they're on. Bob's work is around polypharmacy, and he's very fond of saying there is not one controlled study out there that indicates the effectiveness or risks or harm associated with kids being on multiple psychotropics. How many of you work with children who are on multiple psychotropics? Many of us. In fact, I'd be hard-pressed to come up with a name of a kid that I've worked with in 10 years who wasn't on at least 2 psychotropics, right? And so we're putting a lot of chemicals and a lot of medications into our kids, and I, as a clinician, I will say quickly that there is a time and a place for that, and I've seen medication do magic, but I think we're moving a little fast and loose, and we are not having a good conversation about how trauma masks and mimics mental health symptoms and has profound implications for pharmacology, and I'll get there in a moment. I want to talk to you about our use of ACEs at LaSalle. Shaniek, how am I doing on time? 30 minutes. Okay, can you give me a 15-minute wave? Okay, thank you. I'm going to try to get through a lot of information. The presentation that I'm doing this morning is actually a distillation of a 15-week course I teach at a graduate school, which I've turned into a 4-hour course for all of our staff at LaSalle School, and I'm trying to do it in an hour, so I'm moving fast. But I'm going to be here all day, so if you have questions, come and find me. So at LaSalle, we've been using ACEs to inform our programming, our comprehensive evaluations, our treatment planning, and our group curriculum for about 3 years now. We've collected ACE scores on individuals in all levels of care, our residential foster care program, our outpatient mental health, our substance abuse clinic, our day service educational, our detention diversion. I think that's all of our programs, but we've been collecting ACE scores on kids. And by the way, we do not sit down with a pen and paper and a clipboard and say, number 1, have you ever? We don't do that. What we have done is trained our social workers and trained our clinicians to think about the ACEs questions as they're conducting their psychosocial interviews. And they are gathering that information from a variety of points of perspective. Child self-report, which we all know tends to be pretty poor or limited for a variety of legitimate reasons, but also case history, collateral interviews. So if they come up with any credible and legitimate evidence that a child should have said yes to something, even though they may not have verbally endorsed it during the interview, they score it as a yes. And so we've embedded this into our thinking about comprehensive evaluation, diagnoses, and treatment planning, and it's how we've begun to communicate with one another internally and externally with probation, with child welfare, with family court, with parents, and we're doing a lot of education about the relationship between trauma and downstream mental health, behavioral, social, emotional, and academic problems. And so we really use ACEs as sort of a foundation for talking about the relationship between all those psychosocial domains. And so through the years, we found that kids in our program areas have a significant degree of exposure to adversity, which again, probably comes as no shock to you. In our residential program, we are upstate New York, about 3 hours north of New York City, but we receive and get kids referred to us from just about everywhere in New York State, Long Island, in and around New York City, all the way up to Clinton County, which is on the Canadian border, and Jefferson County, which is Buffalo. It would be quicker for them to go to Ohio for treatment than to come to Albany. It's a pretty big state. It's about 5 hours from us, but we get kids from all over New York State, and we've seen that at any given time when we take a snapshot of our youth, about 55% of our kids, so more than half of our kids, as young as 12, as old as 18, have ACEs, have ACEs of 4 or more. And anecdotally, I can share with you that our younger kids, 12, 13, 14-year-olds, tend to have the higher ACE scores than the older kids. My thinking around that is if they're coming into the highest level of foster care, residential, at the age of 12, that means they've been harmed. And that means their behavior has manifested that harm, or the outward expression of that harm has been the behavior that has justified, for lack of a better word, a pretty hefty intervention, which is removal from home and placement in a residential facility upwards of 5 hours away from their biological family, which is no small intervention by any means. What we know about the relationship, and you can get a lot of this information from the Center for the Developing Child or frameworks at Harvard, but we know that there's a very strong relationship between exposure to violence, trauma, abuse, and neglect. I'm going to use those words interchangeably for the duration of my talk this morning. But we know that kids who are exposed to violence have certain symptoms, a constellation of symptoms that kind of pop up across areas. That we know that kids who are exposed to adversity tend to be impulsive. They tend to have fragmented memory. They tend to not be able to see themselves in the future, or when they do, it's either grandiose or pretty bleak. They tend to be anxious a lot. And so how many, I asked this before, I think, but how many social workers, psychologists, diagnosticians, pediatricians, doctors, people who slap DSM-5 diagnoses on kids? We got a few in the room. I'm a diagnostician, I'm a social worker, clinician by training. So when I think about this list, and I start thinking about how this might map onto the DSM-5, which for those of you who are not clinicians is the psychiatric hand manual for diagnosing mental illness. It's about this thick. You could crush somebody with the book. There's about 500 diagnoses in there. And we tend to diagnose kids in the juvenile justice and child welfare system with the same dozen over and over and over again. And you've all seen these. ADHD, conduct disorder, intermittent explosive, adjustment disorder, reactive attachment disorder, bipolar disorder, right? We don't see a whole lot of PTSD unless we're working with young women, right? Although that's on the climb, right? It's on the rise. So for the diagnosticians in the room, if you get a kid who bounces into your office and the defining presenting problem is that they're impulsive and they're bouncing around in their chair at school and they can't sit still, where do you go diagnostically? ADHD. If you get the same kid, but they're describing him as anxious, where do you go in the DSM? Anxiety. If they're pessimistic or apathetic, lethargic, they just don't seem interested in anything anymore, where do you go diagnostically? Depression. This muddies the water fast for clinicians. It is impossible. I was going to say hard. I changed my mind. It's impossible clinically to get to the right diagnosis unless you've considered how trauma might be manifesting in this child's emotional experience and presenting behavior. In fact, the van der Kolk Center, people are familiar with the name Bessel van der Kolk? He's sort of the godfather of trauma. I met the godfather of Port St. Lucie this morning, but the godfather of trauma is Bessel van der Kolk. He is the reason we have a modern conceptualization of PTSD and trauma. He and his clinicians and his researchers argue, and I strongly agree with the argument and the rationale, if you don't rule out trauma as an explanation of what it is you're seeing, you will get to the wrong diagnosis. Makes sense, right? Hang on to that thought a minute, and we'll come back around. How many of you are in juvenile justice? A few? Okay. I think some of you are just afraid to raise your hand that I might call on you. It's okay. I've got not enough time to call on people, so I'm cruising through this. So my social worker training is not going to kick in. My professor training is. I'm just ramming through the lecture. We know that kids in juvenile justice, they come to us because of something they did, right? But as a system, we need to get kind of past that or beyond that, that what they did is important. And I work with kids who do some pretty harmful stuff. I work with kids who have been adjudicated for sex crimes. So I'm not working with cream puffs at LaSalle. They've hurt people, and I take that very seriously, but I also understand that for whatever reason, they thought that was a good idea. Or maybe that was their only option. Or maybe there was something going on that pushed them to that. And so my training has always been to start with the presenting problem, but to quickly get past that, get underneath that, and start figuring out what was going on prior to. So it's our job as a system, whether you're juvenile justice, child welfare, mental health, public schools, the problem, the presenting behavior, I would argue, is the symptom. And I'm not interested in putting Band-Aids on symptoms. I'm interested in figuring out why the kid is bleeding to begin with. And so we need to get underneath that symptom, underneath and behind that presenting problem, and start thinking and asking, what happened to you? And that moves us to a much more trauma-informed lens and perspective, okay? So it's no longer sufficient in child welfare and juvenile justice or even special ed to solely focus on the problem. This is not just a simple behavioral intervention. We know that kids in the juvenile justice system, and this is an old snapshot, but I'm not aware of any comprehensive survey of juvenile justice. This is a national snapshot of all kids engaged in all levels of juvenile justice about 10, 11 years ago. 43% of kids surveyed 10 years ago were found to have 4 or more mental health diagnoses in the juvenile justice system. Think about the last time you went to a doctor and walked away with 4 diagnoses. I'm getting over a cold. I was in my doctor's office last week. He was on me again about the statin for my high cholesterol. But I was in there for bronchitis. 1 diagnosis. 1. These kids, about half, had 4 or more mental health diagnoses. And when you think about that in the context of what I just said about kids who experience violence, we know that kids in the juvenile justice system have high ACE scores. They have high exposure to violence. It makes sense that they would be exhibiting a lot of that impulsive, aggressive, fragmented memory, distorted sense of self, apathy, all those things that we listed with the Harvard slide a moment ago, and I think we are misunderstanding that behavior and putting a lot of mental health diagnoses on kids, which leads to a lot of medication in kids, which goes back to my buddy Bob Foltz's work on polypharmacy in incarcerated youth. Let's take a look at this study. Again, a pretty old one, but there's a lot to be said with research that we've done years ago. This is a study of children who had been sexually abused. This is based on DSM-4, so the last version, not the most recent, but the prior version of the DSM-4 TR diagnostic criteria for ADHD against PTSD in a population of children who had been sexually abused. I like to think of myself as a pretty good clinician and a good diagnostician, but if the same symptoms get you to PTSD that get you to ADHD, I don't know how to make that differential. Think about what this means for the mental health community. Think about what this means for special education and IEPs. Think about what this means for juvenile justice with all the kids that we've diagnosed with ADHD who have high ACE scores. What if it's trauma? Let's think about this and take it one step further. What's the treatment plan for a kid with ADHD? Medication and supportive psychotherapy to help him understand why he needs to stay on his medication. What's the treatment plan for PTSD? Counseling, supportive psychotherapy, lots of, breathing and emotional regulation. Those are 2 very different treatment plans. What's the medication for ADHD? It's a psychotropic, it's a psychostimulant. I can say this because I'm not a pharmacist or a physician, but essentially a psychostimulant in a class very similar to cocaine in terms of its impact on the brain. Now, the hallmark feature of a traumatized brain is that it's hyper-aroused and overstimulated already. What happens if you take that brain, a PTSD brain, and pour a psychostimulant like cocaine or caffeine on that brain? What's going to happen to that brain in that child? Kaboom, right? And so what if we've been misdiagnosing kids with high trauma exposure? That's a given. High ACE scores, high levels of exposure to violence in their communities, in their families, in their schools, in our courts, in our police stations, in our mental health clinics. If they've experienced adversity and as a result, their brains are overstimulated and they have undiagnosed PTSD or complex trauma, and we are misdiagnosing that for one of a variety of mental health disorders and beginning to mismedicate them, and then we don't see results with medication, so what do? Up the dosage. Right? We're barking up the wrong tree, which is why Vanderkolk and his community have made a very strong and lucid, powerful argument in my mind. If you don't look at and rule out trauma as an explanation for what it is we're seeing, you will miss the mark. And here's the potential harm in what we're doing. And this, again, is what my buddy Bob Foltz is looking at. If you're interested in his work, you can find some of the work that he's publishing and writing up at ACRC. Or the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. So let's drill into neuroscience again. Shaniek, how am I doing? Where are we at? 20 minutes, okay. Here we go. Neuroscience in 5 minutes. Okay, so brain chemistry, fast. When we are stressed, we dump serotonin and cortisol into our brains and bodies. That's survival. That's how when we aren't paying attention, we're texting, we're on the sidewalk, we're about to step into a crosswalk and we don't notice that we don't have the light and there's a bus coming, our body reacts, senses danger, dumps serotonin and cortisol into our bodies, and it generates that fight-flight response, right? And we jump out of the way before we can even think, oh my gosh, a bus is coming, right? Oh my gosh, it's probably mild, but I'm being recorded. So cortisol and adrenaline, naturally occurring, we produce them, cortisol and adrenaline, okay? And so cortisol and adrenaline associated with stress. In small bursts, that's okay, and it does exactly what it's supposed to do. Has anyone had a cortisone shot for something? Can you get that again and again and again for the rest of your life? No. Why not? It's not addictive. It does do harm, but it's not addictive. For athletes, maybe it's addictive because they want to get out on the field. So there's a cycle there. But what happens over time? If athletes get that shot, what happens to the knee, the shoulder? It blows out because cortisone over a long, protracted period of time actually damages and destroys the tissue that in small bursts, it can have an anti-inflammatory effect. It can help. There's medicine in small doses. But medicine only has a certain therapeutic range. When we go outside that therapeutic range, it can do harm. You take 2 aspirin, you don't take 50 to get rid of the headache faster, right? Damage comes with too much for too long. Too much cortisone for too long will damage the tissue it's designed to heal. We make cortisone as cortisol in our bodies. Adrenaline and cortisol over a long period of time will damage our brains and bodies, which is bad. Let me talk about serotonin and dopamine. Think of these as antidotes to stress hormones. When we drink coffee, when we spend time with loved ones, when I hug my daughter, when we have sex, we're releasing massive amounts of dopamine and serotonin. Things that we enjoy are typically associated with serotonin and dopamine to different degrees, to different levels. So you see down in the dopamine, the drug, sex, and food, and probably rock and roll should be there too, I think. But serotonin and dopamine can be released by engaging in pro-social, healthy, positive activities. It can also be released if we engage in unhealthy behavior like drugs and unhealthy sexual relationships. This made a lot of sense to me as I started thinking about the young women I used to work with as a clinician in a residential treatment facility. Many of them had been horrifically sexually abused, trafficked, prostituted, exploited in ways you can't even fathom. And what I noticed is that despite our efforts as a treatment community, a lot of these young women would run away from the facility and engage in some pretty harmful sexual behaviors. And so my teaching, my training, my professional experience said to me, okay, well, there's some learning theory going on, or there's some psychodynamic theory that can explain this cycle of abuse and identification with the aggressor, and that sort of made sense to me. And then when I started thinking about those experiences of those young women who were horrifically sexually and physically abused for most of their young lives, they had enormous rates of cortisol and adrenaline in their bodies. In fact, we know kids with higher ACE scores have higher than average baseline rates of cortisol and adrenaline. And so this is like when we talk about kids going from 0 to 60 in the blink of an eye. They're not going from 0 to 60. They're always at 40. They are